I've knocked on 9,000 doors. It's not a metaphor. That's an actual number from actual campaigns. And when you do that, when you stand on that many doorsteps and look that many people in the eye, something happens to your political theory. It gets very, very concrete because no one at their door is talking about ideology. They're talking about the electric bill. They're talking about the cost of insulin. They're talking about the student loan that somehow is bigger than the day they graduated. They're talking about the math and how it's just not working and not being able to figure out why.
We've come a long way in this series. Episode 1, we felt the loss. Episode 2, we traced how it was engineered. And now, the part that I've been waiting for, we talk about what a fix to the economy actually looks like. Chris, you've spent years running for office, knocking on those 9,000 doors. What did people actually tell you? Before we get to the policy and all the data, what did the ground level reality actually look like?
Yeah, so it's interesting in this time in American politics where people don't know which way is up or what to believe. The one thing that I've heard loud and clear from everyday people at their own doors is that affordability is the number one issue. Let me say that again. Affordability is the absolute number one issue. And here's the thing. People can't quote stats. They generally don't know the inflation rates. They don't know a whole bunch of stats that the policymakers throw around, but they do know the feeling. They know the feeling of having to decide whether or not they're going to pay their mortgage or pay the medical bill they have. They know the feeling of not being able to fix their car the right way. They know their feeling of when they retired, their retirement income went a whole lot farther than it does now. They know the feeling that they are working harder than their parents or grandparents' generation ever had to and not getting nearly as far economically speaking. They feel it, and I think most of us feel it in our gut that this just isn't working, but most people have a really hard time pinning down the actual fact-based answer in the history, which is one reason why I was so keen on putting it in the book.
Well, can you elaborate more then on when it comes to affordability and how that might be that number one issue in the voting booths? Why are some people maybe voting for policies that are actually hurting their own economic interests?
That's a really good question. I think on some hand, it's people don't realize what they're actually voting for. And I think in the last couple of elections, while our channel isn't trying to follow the moment, I think it's important to note that what particularly President Trump ran on and what he's actually doing in office are two very different things. And so when we sit there and say, hey, why are people voting against their economic self-interest? We can't assume that people heard that message. We can't assume that the things in the big, beautiful bill, like the $390 billion a year tax break for the rich and all the cuts to government services that millions upon millions of Americans rely on, I don't think that we should ever assume that people who voted for that side thought that is what is going to happen. Many of us who didn't vote that way can sit here and say it was plain as day, but with the amount of noise on social media, with the amount of siloing in social media channels across the board, I don't think we can assume that right now. And so at the end of the day, the Republican Party also has a really good story that isn't not earned based on facts, that they're pro-economy, they're pro-business. And on the same token, I think the National Democratic Party has been pretty terrible at messaging what Democrats have done. And I don't think we had a really good message about it. As much as the data would tell a very different story, I think we have a really hard time recognizing that the facts and the data don't necessarily immediately equate to people's emotional feeling on it. And so we need to get a whole lot better at messaging it as people running for office, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. And I think we have to get a whole lot better at educating people of how this actually impacts them. I think the day that you can just sit back and trust national policymakers to have your best interests at heart are probably long gone. And I think people are waking up to that right now.
Well, to your point, the big beautiful bill just recently passed. How is that impacting the everyday person?
Yeah, so it's interesting that in the big beautiful bill, I already talked about the 390 billion a year in cuts for the richest Americans. That adds to the national debt, which is largely going to be paid for by taxes in the future. We are already at a state where we pay about $900 billion a year in interest payments. That's about how much our entire Department of Defense costs every year. At the same time, the same government who passed that bill said we cannot afford the roughly $18 billion it costs to have 2.3 million Americans maintain their food stamps or their SNAP benefits. That means that rural grocery stores are closing all over this country because they can't afford to stay open without the subsidies from the federal government. It means that a whole bunch of Americans who are relying on that, they didn't get richer overnight. It's not like we lifted 2.3 million people out of poverty and now they don't need those benefits. We just took the benefits away. And the requirement for earning those benefits is already so low that to say that we can't afford that when we're giving tax breaks to the tune of 390 billion a year, it's just the math doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that's just one example.
I've heard it said that it was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of America. Is that something that you think is can be substantiated?
It absolutely can't be. And this isn't the first time. And I think that's the real tragic part here. And over the past couple of decades, we have done more to transfer wealth from the bottom 50% to the top 1% than any point in American history. In fact, I threw out a number in the book that may sound large, which it is, but we have transferred over $50 trillion worth of wealth from the bottom 50% to the top 1%.
That's insane. You can't even picture that in your head. How did that happen?
That happened in the last video. We talked about corporate profit margins and how they've doubled from the 1980s to now. And what you need to know about the US stock market is well over 90% of it is owned by top 10% on the economic ladder. And so all of these policies that we talked about in the last episode of deregulating business, cutting corporate tax rates, cutting high income tax rates, allowing stock buybacks to happen. All these are mechanisms to say everything that you and I and the audience is buying at the store is more expensive than what it actually should be. And that extra money is going into basically these stock valuations, which is going to the top 1%. And that's how the actual mechanisms behind the scene is working, because those are the people that already own it. Or you look at, why is our median household or the median price for a home in the US well over $400,000, and a lot of times what a median household worker earns. Well, who owns most of the property? Wealthy people own more of the property. And so they don't want more to be built. And they don't want more to be built in the neighborhoods that they live in. And so it makes it really hard for people to break into that. But at the same time, it all benefits their overall. Anyone who owns assets is benefiting from this. So if you already own a home, you have benefited from this. If you already own stocks, you have benefited from this. But it keeps going.
So we're not trying to vilify anybody for having money per se, right? But it's more about the amount of influence that actually outweighs some individuals in a certain bracket than it does over the collective of society, right?
Yeah, you're not inherently a bad person if you have money. I know quite a lot of wealthy people that are also good people. But this is also, and we haven't really gotten into this, maybe we should at a future video, but how much money plays a role in our politics. So like 97% of the candidates who win their election have more money than the other side. If you want to run for Congress in even a rural part of Connecticut, let's say, you better be ready to take a year and a half off from work, and you better be ready and have a pathway to fundraising somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million. And that's on the cheap end. And we saw the special election a little while ago with Thomas Massie, the most expensive primary challenge in American history. And a huge chunk of that is coming from a very, very small sliver of the American population. And what happens when you're a candidate running for political office to have some form of political power, if you have to fundraise that much money, you're spending up to 70% of your time fundraising, which means you're spending 70% of your time on the phone or at events with people who have money to donate. And I'm sorry, you can be a really, really good person. You can be a really amazing human being who happens to be a billionaire. I'm not saying that that is impossible. But what I'm also saying is that when you're a billionaire, your interest in how you view the world is going to be a lot different than the person earning 40K a year trying to survive. It just is. And until we get money out of politics, unfortunately, that's probably going to continue to be the case.
So, as the way things are currently operating, then we're having candidates who don't actually represent America's interests, oftentimes on either side, right?
Yeah,
I
I
guess you
think
made
that's the real.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I got excited for that one. I think that's exactly right. I think that's why people are fed up with politics. And we can show this with data that the US Congress is just as likely to institute a policy idea if you're only looking at average working class families, and if 0% of average working class American families think it's a good idea, or 100%, Congress is equally likely to pass that, which is insane. Yeah, if you just look at the economic elites, it's almost perfectly correlated, meaning as more and more economic elites believe in it, the chance that it will pass goes up dramatically. And likewise, if no one believes in it, the chance it will pass is very small. And in a system that is supposed to actually represent all of us, not just the economic elites, like that's the sign of a broken system. And yet we have political parties at the national level that keep campaigning, keep acting like they're trying to represent the average working class person. Now, both parties are trying to say that, and then you have to really look at what they've been doing. One party at least tries, the other party just ignores it. So they're not equal, but I get how people look at what is being promised in campaigns and look at what has actually happened and get really just tired of feeling like they're getting lied to. And I think that is where a lot of the things like taxation and stuff comes from. It's really what they're talking about is there's just an inherent distrust now.
Well, in the interest of being able to take back our power, right? Our influence, at least. You had this striking concept in your book that literally was about taking back, and in this case, it was 2 trillion. Can you go into that further?
Yeah. So basically, the 2 trillion idea is talking about if profit margins would have stayed what they were at when it was the sort of 1981 level, right before all the Reaganomics took hold, then every American household would have paid roughly $12,000 less dollars a year. And if you really look at the excesses of stock buybacks and executive pay, then you can see where the money is going to and who it's coming from. And unfortunately, you can't just flip a switch and do it in any given year of just like getting a $50 trillion refund for decades of this wealth redistribution. But what you can do is play with these dials and say, we're going to eliminate stock buybacks. We're going to actually tax corporate profits. We're going to actually tax the richest among us in a way that's more fair. And then within 20 years, we could eliminate our $40 trillion debt if you had a system that can pull back $2 trillion a year. You can also give every household that's earning under $400,000 about $15,500 back a year. Like, we have the wealth in the system to make these choices. They are real choices we can make. And that $2 trillion a year is really just the idea that, we basically, in whole terms, we basically pay about $4 trillion worth a year in corporate profits in the United States. And profit margins have doubled since 1981. So half of that would have been 1980 levels. What should we do with that $2 trillion? We can do a whole lot of good for a whole lot of people.
So concretely, in your agenda for the future, right? What would you change in all that? What would you rewrite?
Yeah, so basically, I think probably one of the best starting places is to go look at everything Reagan did in 1980s and undo it all. And it sounds simple. It's a lot. There was a whole lot of different bills that did a whole lot of different things. but it's also in black and white. Like this is actually in our current US code right now, and we know who wrote it when they wrote it. Like we know all of this. So it's actually relatively easy to undo. So before Reagan, our top sort of marginal tax rates were in the 70s. They were up in the 90% under Eisenhower. I'm not suggesting we need to go all the way back to that. But nowadays, the effective tax rate that people like Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the country, is paying, he pays less in the amount of taxes in terms of like the percentage he pays than his secretary. That's insane. And he admitted to it. And it's on public record. We don't have to guess about this stuff. The stock buybacks I'll keep talking about over and over and over again. We can either make them illegal or heavily tax them. We can raise corporate tax rates back to what they were before the Reaganomics took over. And that feels like a really long way to go. But we can also do things like make there be no tax on survival. So basically telling people you don't have to pay taxes on anything if you earn less than 50K a year, or you don't have to pay any income tax on your first 50K in a year. We can close the tax loopholes that have become the norm. And here's what I want people to understand about tax loopholes. The United States government, if you're an individual worker as an American working overseas, you still have to file US taxes. In fact, for those workers who work for the United Nations, most other countries, if you're working for the United Nations overseas, you don't pay their version of federal taxes. The UN has to give Americans stipends so that Americans can pay taxes to America, even though they may not be working in America. Like, so we have a tax system that goes to try to collect income taxes from working class people all around the world. Yet we can't be bothered with American companies who set up one random office in Panama or Ireland or all these other countries that are safe havens. That sort of stuff is just insane to me.
No, I mean, I think you've brought up some very, very fair points. But then let me ask, in some way, somehow, this takes us back to the conversation about socialism. For someone out there who's saying, hey, you like corporations, they need to have these different loopholes in place in order to just become successful and viable in our industry, don't go down the path of socialism. What would you say?
I would say this. Everything I just proposed and the answer I just gave are answers that we as America already used to have before Reaganomics changed it all. And the definition of conservative used to be protecting what already exists and then doing slow incremental changes to make sure we know what works. And so one could argue that going back to the system we had before Reagan isn't at all socialism. It is still a market-based economy with different rules around it that benefit more people rather than fewer people. And it would be the conservative answer to go back to what already worked in the United States.
Oh, so making America great again?
At least making America more fair again.
Ah, well, that's a good point. So we started this series with a feeling, a before and an after, a world that existed where ordinary work was made for a livable life. And then there's the world that we're living in now, where that same work doesn't add up the same way anymore.
And here's what I want everyone to take away from these 3 episodes that we just did. This wasn't fate. It wasn't progress. It was policy. Specific laws, specific deregulations, specific people making specific decisions at a specific moment in American history.
Which means it's reversible. Not easy, not quick, but reversible.
And we've done it before. Lincoln remade the economy. FDR remade the economy. By the way, one Republican, one Democrat, just saying. Not because it was inevitable, but because people understood what was wrong, organized around it, and demanded something different. That's what this show is for. That's what my book is for. Not to make you angry, though a little anger is probably appropriate, but to make you literate, because you can't fight something you can't name.
And power of the people isn't just the name, it's a theory of change. The power was always there, it just needs a direction. So thank you so much for spending these past 3 episodes with us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you next time.